can get you some more analysis on the current situation in Niger. Paul Melly is a consulting fellow at the Africa programme at Chatham House. Paul, thanks for speaking to France 24 this afternoon. You would have heard us saying then ECOWAS have scheduled a meeting to discuss the crisis further on Thursday. It comes, of course, after junta leaders have said no to several meetings, either with ECOWAS, the African Union or the United Nations. Do they have any options left at this stage? ECOWAS, I mean?
I think they do. First of all, they can further tighten the sanctions. And Niger is a landlocked country. It's very heavily dependent on imports that come in through coastal West African countries, particularly Nigeria and Benin. And although Niger has borders with countries that are not participating in the sanctions effort, such as Burkina Faso and Mali, Algeria, Libya, those are much, much more difficult and expensive routes. And in the case of the routes through Burkina and Mali, they're routes which are very, very insecure, subject to jihadist attack. Those roads are often closed by violence. So the sanctions pressure really can be ratcheted up. It's also, Niger is also a member of the CFA franc single currency bloc, which means that the regional central bank in Dakar in Senegal is in a position to impose really heavy financial penalties. It can really cause problems for the banking system in Niger.
So we could see further, as you say, Paul, we could see further financial sanctions put in place. We know that the president of Nigeria had slapped more sanctions on Niger on Tuesday. Leading up to this ultimatum that ECOWAS gave, there was a lot of talk about military intervention. We're now hearing far more about diplomacy. Is that because the impact of a military intervention is really sinking in both, in terms of the economy or, the violence that this could ensue?
I think ECOWAS was always very, very well aware of the difficulties of military intervention. The bloc has had a long history of trying to manage the security crises in West Africa. It's been discussing for many months the development of a regional force to try and tackle those. So it's not as if people in ECOWAS were naive or over-assuming what could be achieved by military force. But what I think we need to think of last Sunday's deadline was they set that as a moment when, up to that point, the putschists could have handed back power to the constitutional government, if you like, without consequence. And at a moment when international support for ECOWAS was at its very strongest, they signaled that they could include military action among the options. But I think they will take time. They will really try and pace what they're doing, because there's a lot of reluctance, political reluctance within ECOWAS countries themselves to contemplate the use of force. Many opposition politicians are raising questions about this. Many northern Nigerian politicians are saying you really must exhaust all the negotiating avenues. And there are signs that that pressure could tell.
There have been political analysts, Paul, that have suggested the longer that the junta remains in charge of the country, that you will, the more likely they are to stay. And questions raised about ECOWAS's credibility. Do they look bad? Do they lose credibility given the ongoing situation in the country?
I don't think they lose credibility. We have to be realistic about what is actually possible. Just as, with the Ukraine crisis, many people in Europe are very sympathetic about Ukraine, but no one is suggesting that NATO should actually send its forces into Ukraine to join that war. You have to pace things by the situation that you're in. And ECOWAS knows that a military operation would be very difficult, even one that was very targeted, just trying to target the leaders of the junta. Even that would be a really difficult move. And there is a long tradition in West Africa of resolving crises through negotiation and compromise. And the situation we're in at the moment, and this is really important in terms of African public opinion, West African public opinion, is that ECOWAS is signaling that it is ready to negotiate. It wants to send envoys. But it's the junta that is refusing to talk to anybody.
There will be those, Paul, who say that, resolving things diplomatically hasn't worked in Burkina Faso, it hasn't worked in Mali, and that essentially those countries could have set a precedent for what's going on in Niger.
That is true to some extent. Although Burkina Faso, Mali and Guinea, which is also under a military government, they have all promised elections for next year. But we know that remains a sort of uncertain promise until it's actually concretized with free and fair elections in which all candidates can take part. We won't really know if the juntas in those countries have been pushed into restoring democracy. The same would be true in Niger. And that's why ECOWAS has felt that it needs to take a really strong line. But I think it is also trying to be realistic. It's facing a real dilemma here because the risk, West Africa is a region 4 years ago, it was all elected constitutional governments. And now we have 4 countries that are under military rule. So
indeed.
It's a difficult judgment to make.
There's been a lot of talk, Paul, about who will benefit ultimately from this military coup that's currently happening in Niger. We had the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, speaking to our sister station this week. For him, diplomacy is the privileged route, you might say. Russia and Wagner, as far as he's concerned, could, stand to gain from this. Your thoughts on that?
Well, they could stand to gain from it because Russia is clearly trying to re-establish itself as an actor who matters. And in one way of doing that is, as it were, to jump into situations that arise when there are countries in crisis and Russia then props up a military regime or, in the case of the Central African Republic, a regime with a controversial political situation, the sending of Wagner mercenaries and so on. But from the Niger point of view, from the point of view of the Nigerian junta, up to now, the Nigerian military have been relatively effective in tackling jihadist violence. And the track record of Wagner in Mali is that, if anything, that can make the situation worse if the mercenaries come in. And so while the Russians may spot an opportunity to move in, it's not entirely clear that the Nigerian military, even those who've staged the coup, would find it terribly useful to bring in Russian mercenaries. And that would also complicate the very close defense relationships they have with France and the US that are, in the case of the Americans, go back a very, very long time. And so disrupting those or bringing a definitive end to those it might be popular on the street. As we can see, there are some anti-French demonstrations that have taken place in Niamey. But in terms of, from the point of view of the Niger army and its ability to fight the jihadists, trying to change defense partners and disrupt all that could seriously weaken its capacity.
I mean, Paul, you raise an interesting point there, and it won't have escaped anyone, the anti-French sentiment that we're seeing certainly in the capital, Niamey, with protests. I mean, some 30,000 people in a stadium on Sunday, with that sentiment clear. What do you put that down to? And do you think that France should have perhaps reduced its involvement in these countries before we ended up here? I'm talking about Niger for this particular instance.
Well, I think we need to make a bit of a distinction between the French approach in Mali. They were asked to intervene in 2013, of course, by the Malian government to fight the jihadists and prevent a jihadist advance on Bamako. But over the subsequent years, the French presence was pretty high profile, very visible. There was a lot of media coverage, and quite a lot of West Africans were uncomfortable with that. But in Niger, France has tried generally to take a much more discreet profile, and there's been a strong emphasis on the fact that any operations where the French troops are involved, they're actually operating at the behest of and under the command of the Nigerian forces. They're not doing anything on their own. And it's Niger that asked France to actually increase its military presence. It's President Bazoum who said, please can you redeploy some of the soldiers who were in Mali, because we need to protect our borders against the risk of jihadist overspill from Mali and Burkina Faso. So it's quite a difficult position for the French to pursue. They've tried to keep a relatively low profile. If you go to Niamey, when you arrive, you see the French base, but afterwards, when you're just in Niger day to day, you could go for weeks without seeing any evidence of French military presence, basically hardly any French public presence at all.
So how do we explain these images that we're seeing with Nigerians asking for France to leave? How do we qualify that?
Because there's a widespread disenchantment right across West Africa, particularly among young urban populations, are very fed up with the French regional presence, and they've come to associate that with their own political elites. So we've seen a situation where France and in fact the EU more widely have been trying to build a new partnership relationship, a more equal partnership relationship, if you like, with the elected governments across Africa, particularly West Africa. And yet, in many cases, those governments, the political leaders, are suffering from quite a lot of popular disillusion at home. There are very many people, young people, often big problems of unemployment, underemployment, people living on very informal, fragile incomes, a lot of frustration with their own political class. And that also feeds through to resentment, and resentment even, for example, of the CFA franc currency, because that currency is underpinned by a guarantee from France. And yet, although governments are looking at possible options for reforming the currency, obviously that's a very difficult long-term technical policy issue. It's not easily resolved, but the mood on the streets often is one of frustration, a perception that France is still too involved.
Okay.
And yet there are still practical security and economic challenges.
Okay, well, Paul, you've been unpacking some of the complex questions for us in Niger amid this ongoing coup d'etat. Thanks very much for speaking to France 24 today. Thank you.